My sister Claire dropped the announcement over dinner on a Tuesday night, not asking, just stating it the way she'd state the weather. Starting tomorrow, my boyfriend and his parents live here. I smiled. It had been an unremarkable evening up until that point, the kind we'd settled into over the 2 years since we'd inherited the house together, taking turns cooking, catching each other up on work, and small daily frustrations over whatever meal one of us had managed to throw together after a long day. I'd made pasta that night, nothing fancy, just something warm and easy after a long shift at the clinic where I worked as a physical therapist, and Claire had come home a little later than usual, distracted in a way I'd noticed but hadn't thought much of, her phone buzzing repeatedly throughout dinner in a way that suggested some ongoing conversation she wasn't fully present for at our table. I remember thinking, in the split second after she said it, that I must have misheard her, that the sentence didn't quite make sense strung together the way she'd said it, too casual for the actual weight of what she was announcing. But the way she immediately set down her fork and looked at me, waiting, confirmed I'd heard exactly right. She looked at me for a second too long, clearly expecting an argument, maybe even bracing for one, her posture stiffening slightly the way it always did before a confrontation, a habit I recognized from decades of being her older sister, watching her prepare defenses for arguments that hadn't even started yet. When I didn't immediately object, didn't launch into the fight she'd apparently rehearsed on the drive home, probably running through counterarguments to whatever objections she assumed I'd raise, she narrowed her eyes slightly, visibly recalibrating. That's it? No pushback. Nope, I said, taking another bite of pasta, keeping my expression as neutral and unbothered as I could manage despite the storm of thoughts suddenly running through my head. Sounds great. The house we shared had been our grandmother's, a modest but sturdy 2-story home on a quiet street where she'd raised our mother and, later, helped raise both of us during the years our own parents' marriage had been falling apart around us. She'd left it to both of us jointly 2 years earlier when she passed, following a brief illness that none of us had fully prepared for despite her age, with the explicit understanding, written into the will itself in language our grandmother had apparently insisted on including after some long conversation with her lawyer, that neither of us could make major changes to occupancy without the other's written consent. Claire knew this. She'd been present for every single conversation with the estate lawyer, sitting beside me in Mr. Faraday's office as he'd read through the terms of the will, nodding along at the specific language about the house needing to remain, in our grandmother's own words as read aloud that day, a stable and shared home for both my granddaughters, not a source of conflict or unilateral decisions. She'd signed the same documents I had, initialed the same pages, and I remembered clearly how she'd actually been the one to ask Faraday a follow-up question that day about exactly what major changes to occupancy would technically cover, curious even then, before any of this had become relevant, about the practical boundaries of what we could each decide independently versus what required both our agreement. I mean it, she pressed, apparently unsatisfied with my calm agreement, searching my face for the sarcasm she expected to find lurking somewhere beneath my expression. Derek's parents lost their apartment. Some issue with the building, mold, or something in the walls that the landlord wasn't dealing with properly, and they got an emergency notice to vacate. They need somewhere to stay while they sort things out, and Derek's staying with them to help. It's just temporary. Temporary how long? I asked, still keeping my tone light, curious rather than confrontational, though internally I was already running through implications, logistics, the practical reality of suddenly sharing bathrooms and kitchen space with 3 additional adults, none of whom I'd ever spent more than a few hours around. A few months, probably. Maybe longer if the market's tough right now, which apparently it is, according to Derek. Rental prices have gone up a lot since the last time his parents looked for a place. Sure, I said. Sounds fine to me. She stared at me for another moment, clearly thrown by how easily I was accepting this, her eyebrows drawing together in the particular expression she'd worn since childhood whenever something didn't unfold the way she'd anticipated, whether that was a board game not going her way or, apparently, an older sister failing to argue about an unannounced household expansion. I let her sit in that confusion for a beat longer than strictly necessary, watching her try to figure out whether my calm acceptance was genuine or some kind of delayed reaction she should still be bracing for. The truth was, I already knew something she didn't yet realize I knew, something that made her announcement land very differently than she probably expected it to. 2 weeks earlier, on a Saturday afternoon I'd set aside to finally tackle the attic, digging through decades of accumulated boxes while looking for our grandmother's holiday decorations before the season got fully underway. I'd found a folder of documents I hadn't known existed, tucked into an old filing box alongside tax records and utility bills from years past, buried deep enough that it had clearly been placed there deliberately rather than simply forgotten. The folder contained financial records and correspondence, letters dating back over 2 decades, that told a very different story about Derek's father, Robert, than the one Claire had apparently been fed over the past several months of dating him. I'd sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor for nearly an hour that Saturday afternoon, reading through letter after letter, a loan agreement with our grandmother's careful signature at the bottom, follow-up correspondence asking politely, then less politely, about repayment, and finally, near the bottom of the folder, a final letter dated almost 10 years ago where our grandmother had apparently given up entirely, writing simply that she hoped Robert would eventually find his way to doing right by this, a phrase that had stuck with me uncomfortably in the weeks since. I hadn't said anything yet, not to Claire, not to anyone, still turning over in my mind exactly how and when to bring it up, uncertain whether it was even my place to interfere in her relationship over a debt that predated either of our involvement with Derek entirely. I'd told myself I was waiting for the right moment, some natural opening in conversation that wouldn't feel like an ambush, though if I'm honest with myself now, some part of me had also been quietly hesitant, not wanting to be the sister who ruined things, who dug up old grievances and used them as ammunition against someone Claire clearly cared about. But Claire, without realizing it, had just handed me exactly that opening on a silver platter, announcing not just a relationship milestone but an actual, immediate cohabitation with the very family this old debt belonged to, 3 unsuspecting houseguests arriving the next morning, completely unaware that their host had spent an entire Saturday afternoon 2 weeks earlier reading through the paper trail of a promise Robert had apparently never intended to keep. I finished my pasta that night in a state of quiet calculation, smiling whenever Claire glanced my way, letting her wonder, letting her sit with the unexpected ease of my reaction, while privately deciding that whatever conversation needed to happen about that folder, it would happen soon, and it would happen on my terms, once everyone had actually settled into the house, and the reality of the situation had fully set in for all of us. The next morning, right on schedule, Derek's white pickup truck pulled into our driveway, followed by an aging sedan I assumed belonged to his parents, both vehicles packed to capacity with boxes and furniture, and I watched from the kitchen window as 3 strangers began unloading their belongings like this was already settled, already decided, without so much as a conversation with me about what temporary actually meant or what house rules might apply to 3 additional adults suddenly living under our roof. I stood there with my coffee mug in hand, watching a woman I assumed was Linda direct traffic from the sedan, pointing Derek toward which boxes should go where, the whole scene carrying an efficiency that suggested they'd clearly discussed and planned this move extensively, without any input from me at all. I let them get everything moved into the guest rooms before I made my way downstairs, deliberately taking my time finishing my coffee, checking emails on my phone, giving myself a few extra minutes to settle my own thoughts before greeting people I now knew far more about than they realized. When I finally walked outside, I greeted everyone with a pleasant smile that Claire eyed suspiciously the entire time, clearly still waiting for the other shoe to drop, glancing between me and our new house guests like she expected me to suddenly reveal some hidden agenda mid-handshake. Derek's parents, Linda and Robert, seemed nice enough on the surface, polite in that overly careful way people are when they know they're imposing on someone else's generosity, Linda thanking me twice within the first 5 minutes for opening our home to them, her voice carrying genuine warmth that made it harder than I expected to hold onto my earlier resolve. Robert, though, struck me differently the moment I shook his hand, something about the interaction matching almost exactly what I'd read in that folder from the attic, a little too firm, a little too eager to project confidence and ease, the handshake of a man accustomed to smoothing over first impressions through sheer charm rather than substance. "We really appreciate this," Linda said, setting a box down in the front hallway, wiping her hands on her jeans before extending one toward me again, as if the first handshake hadn't been sufficient to convey her gratitude. "We won't be any trouble, I promise. Just until we get back on our feet." This whole situation with the apartment came up so suddenly, we really didn't have many options. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone warm and unbothered despite everything churning beneath the surface. "Take your time settling in. I actually wanted to have everyone sit down together tonight, once you're unpacked. Kind of a house meeting, go over a few things, make sure everyone's comfortable with expectations while you're here. Nothing formal, just practical stuff like bathroom schedules and grocery contributions, that kind of thing." Claire shot me a look from across the hallway, clearly parsing whether "house meeting" was code for the argument she'd been bracing for since dinner the night before, her eyes narrowing slightly in a silent question I chose not to answer just yet. I just smiled again and went back to making a fresh pot of coffee for everyone, letting the uncertainty simmer a little longer, aware that my calm, accommodating demeanor was clearly unsettling her far more than an actual confrontation would have. Throughout the morning, as everyone continued unpacking, I found small moments to observe the new dynamic settling into our house, watching Derek move easily between his parents' room and Claire's, comfortable in a space that had, until yesterday, belonged exclusively to the two of us. He seemed like a genuinely decent guy, attentive to Claire in small ways I noticed and appreciated, carrying boxes for his mother without being asked, checking in on his father's back after some comment about lifting the heavier furniture pieces. None of what I'd learned about Robert reflected on Derek directly, I reminded myself, and I made a conscious effort throughout that morning not to let my growing tension bleed into how I treated him. That afternoon, while everyone else was occupied unpacking and Linda had started rearranging our kitchen cabinets with an enthusiasm that made Claire visibly wince from the living room, I slipped out to the back porch and called our grandmother's estate lawyer, Mr. Faraday, a careful, old-fashioned man who'd handled her affairs for decades and who I trusted completely, having worked with him closely during the entire probate process after her death. I explained the situation as clearly as I could manage, the sudden addition of 3 unplanned residents to a house governed by a fairly specific occupancy clause in the will, and asked him to walk me through exactly what our legal options were, given that Claire had made this decision entirely without my written consent. Exactly the scenario our grandmother had apparently anticipated when she'd insisted on that clause in the first place. "You're well within your rights to object formally," Faraday said, his familiar, measured voice carrying its usual calm authority even through the phone. The language your grandmother insisted on including was quite deliberate. She wanted to ensure that neither of you could be put in a position where major household decisions were made unilaterally, precisely to avoid situations like this one. Though I'd recommend having a direct conversation with your sister first, laying out the terms clearly, before escalating to anything more formal. Sometimes these things resolve themselves once everyone understands the actual boundaries in place. "There's something else," I said, deciding to mention the folder while I had him on the phone, curious whether he might have any additional context about the loan I'd discovered. I found some old paperwork in the attic. A loan agreement between my grandmother and a man named Robert Holloway, dated about 23 years ago. It looks like it was never repaid. There was a pause on the line, and I could hear Faraday shifting through what sounded like old files on his end. "Holloway," he repeated slowly. "That name is familiar, actually. Your grandmother mentioned him to me once, years ago, in passing, something about a business venture that hadn't worked out the way she'd hoped. She never pursued formal collection, if I recall correctly, decided it wasn't worth the friction it might cause with mutual acquaintances at the time. But she did keep meticulous records of everything, which sounds like exactly what you found." "That's the same Robert who's currently moving into our guest room," I said, watching through the porch window as the man himself carried a lamp through our front door. Faraday was quiet for a moment. "Well, that is certainly an interesting coincidence, or perhaps not entirely a coincidence at all, depending on how much your sister's boyfriend actually knows about his father's history with your family. I'd suggest handling that conversation delicately, but I don't think you're under any obligation to simply sit on that information indefinitely, particularly given the circumstances you're describing." I thanked him, hung up, and spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the folder I'd found in the attic one more time, spreading the documents across my bed where nobody would stumble across them accidentally, cross-referencing names and dates, making sure I had every detail straight before that evening's house meeting. I read through the final letter again, our grandmother's careful, disappointed handwriting at the bottom, hoping Robert would eventually find his way to doing right by this, and felt a fresh wave of resolve settle over whatever hesitation I'd been carrying since discovering the folder 2 weeks earlier. By early evening, as the smell of something Linda had started cooking in our kitchen drifted up through the house, I had a fairly clear sense of exactly how I wanted the conversation to unfold, though I had a feeling, watching Claire move nervously between rooms, checking on everyone, glancing at me periodically with that same searching expression from breakfast, that she wasn't going to take any of this well, no matter how calmly I approached it. That evening, once everyone had settled around our living room, plates of the dinner Linda had insisted on cooking as a thank you gesture balanced on their laps, chicken and rice with a sauce that smelled genuinely wonderful despite the tension I could feel building in my own chest. I let the conversation drift through easy small talk for a while first. I asked Robert about his work history, casual questions that felt friendly enough on the surface, but were really, I'll admit, small tests, watching how he described his career, a string of business ventures over the decades, most of them ending, according to his own telling, due to bad timing or partners who didn't hold up their end. Linda filled in details here and there, defensive in a way that suggested old, well-worn family patterns, smoothing over gaps in Robert's stories the way people do when they've had years of practice managing someone else's narrative. Claire sat close to Derek on the love seat, visibly trying to relax into the evening, occasionally shooting me those same searching glances, waiting for whatever was coming. I let dinner run its course, complimented Linda genuinely on the meal, which really was quite good, and waited until plates had mostly emptied and the conversation had reached a natural lull before I finally reached for the folder I'd set discreetly on the side table earlier that afternoon. I wanted to bring something up, I said, keeping my voice even, deliberately calm, partly because I think it's important context for all of us living here together, and partly because I think Claire deserves to have the full picture before this arrangement moves any further. First, I explained the occupancy clause in our grandmother's will, calmly and without accusation, simply stating the legal reality that any change in household residence required both my written consent and Claire's, something Claire clearly hadn't fully considered before inviting 3 people to move in overnight. I watched Derek's parents exchange an uncomfortable glance at this, clearly unaware that the arrangement they'd assumed was settled actually carried more legal weight and complication than they'd realized, and Claire's face flushed with the beginning of embarrassment layered under defensiveness, her shoulders drawing inward slightly. "I'm not saying no," I clarified, before Claire could interrupt, holding up a hand gently. "I'm saying we needed to actually discuss this properly, which we didn't do. But that's not actually the main thing I wanted to bring up tonight." I pulled out the folder from the attic, setting it on the coffee table between us, papers just visible enough at the edge to suggest their age, the slightly yellowed corners of decades-old correspondence, and watched Robert's expression shift the instant he recognized what it was, or perhaps simply sensed what it might contain, color draining slightly from his face even as he tried to maintain his composure, setting his fork down with deliberate care as though buying himself a few extra seconds to prepare a response. "I found us a couple weeks ago going through Grandma's old boxes, looking for holiday decorations," I said, watching the room carefully now, every small reaction. Turns out she and Robert had some business dealings together years back before I was even born. A loan Grandma gave him to help start a business that never actually got off the ground, one he never repaid, according to these records, despite multiple letters asking for repayment over the following decade. The room went silent in a way that felt heavier than any silence we'd sat through that entire day, Linda's fork frozen halfway to her mouth, Derek looking between his father and me with an expression I could only describe as blindsided confusion. Claire looked between me and Robert, confusion and dawning understanding fighting for space across her face, her eyes moving rapidly between the folder and Robert's suddenly stiff posture. "What is she talking about?" she finally asked, turning to Derek, who looked equally lost. "I don't know," Derek said quietly, and I believed him immediately. watching genuine surprise settle into his features. "Dad, what is she talking about?" "That was a long time ago," Robert said quietly, not quite denying it, his eyes fixed somewhere on the coffee table rather than meeting anyone's gaze directly. "Things were different back then. I always meant to pay her back eventually. Things got complicated financially, and then more time passed than I intended, and eventually it felt too late to bring up." 23 years is a long time to mean to do something, I said, not unkindly but firmly, keeping my voice steady even as I felt Claire's eyes on me, gauging my tone. "I'm not trying to punish anyone for something that happened decades ago. I understand people go through difficult financial periods, and I understand things get complicated. But I think Claire deserves to know the full context before deciding whether inviting her family to live in the house her grandmother built, the house that specific loan never got repaid on, is something she wants to do without at least understanding the whole picture." Linda had gone very quiet beside Robert, her earlier warmth replaced by something more guarded, and I watched her glance at her husband with an expression that suggested this wasn't entirely news to her either, that she'd known, on some level, about this particular chapter of their financial history, even if she'd never expected it to surface in exactly this moment, in exactly this house. Claire sat very still for a long moment, processing everything, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, not anger at me exactly, but a dawning recognition of how quickly she'd agreed to something significant without asking enough questions first, swept up in wanting to help Derek's family through a difficult moment, wanting to be generous and supportive in a relationship still relatively new but clearly important to her. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Claire finally asked me, her voice carrying more hurt than anger. "Before they even started packing their car this morning. Why did you let them move all their stuff in first?" "Honestly," I said, deciding the moment called for full transparency rather than any further careful maneuvering. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, and some part of me wondered if I was overreacting, whether it was even my place to say anything about a debt that has nothing to do with our current lives. But then you made the announcement so suddenly, without even asking, and I realized I couldn't just sit on this information while everyone settled in like nothing needed to be discussed first. The conversation that followed was long and uncomfortable, stretching well past when Linda's carefully prepared dinner had gone cold on everyone's plates, but ultimately honest in a way our house desperately needed. Robert, eventually, dropped much of his earlier defensiveness, admitting more fully what had happened, how the failed business venture had left him deeply in debt at the time, how he'd genuinely intended to repay our grandmother once things stabilized, and how, as years passed and shame accumulated alongside the unpaid balance, he'd simply avoided the subject entirely rather than face it directly, a pattern, he admitted quietly, that had shaped more of his life than he was proud to acknowledge. Derek, visibly shaken by the revelation, apologized repeatedly to both Claire and me, clearly embarrassed on his father's behalf, offering immediately to help arrange some kind of repayment plan, an offer Robert accepted with obvious discomfort, but also, I noticed, something like relief, as though a weight he'd been carrying silently for over 2 decades had finally been set down where everyone could see it. Robert and Linda ended up staying, but under clearer terms this time. A written agreement about duration and contribution to expenses that Claire and I drew up together the following week with Faraday's guidance. Everyone finally operating from the same set of facts rather than assumptions, the earlier vague promise of temporary, now attached to specific dates and specific expectations that satisfied the legal requirements of our grandmothers while also, I hoped, giving everyone involved a clearer, more honest foundation to build from. Claire thanked me later that night, once everyone else had gone to bed, sitting together on the back porch the way we used to when we were kids working through disagreements before bed, the porch light casting a soft yellow glow over the yard our grandmother had once tended so carefully. "I should have talked to you first," she admitted, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea. "I got caught up wanting to help and didn't think it through. I just saw Derek stressed about his parents and wanted to fix it immediately, the way I always do." "I know," I said. "That's kind of your thing." She laughed, some of the earlier tension finally breaking, the sound easing something in my own chest that had been tight since discovering that folder 2 weeks earlier. "You could have just told me about the folder right away, you know. instead of smiling like that at dinner and letting me sit there confused all day, wondering what was wrong with you. Where's the fun in that? I said, and this time, when I smiled, she smiled back, both of us settling into the kind of comfortable quiet that only comes after working through something difficult together, the porch swing creaking gently beneath us as the house behind us, fuller now than it had been in years, finally settled into an uneasy but honest kind of peace.